When Vera opened her eyes, the light from the crystal chandelier fell precisely on the diamond ring on her ring finger, cutting a cold, almost cruel gleam. She recognized this lamp. Hand-blown in Italy, 3,600 pieces of crystal, each carefully angled to ensure that whoever stood at the center of the banquet hall would be bathed in the most perfect halo of light. In her past life, standing here, she had only felt warmth and radiance, as if the whole world were blessing her. Now, as she looked again, it was nothing more than an elaborately designed cage, meant to bind her, a willing prey who had walked right in. Applause surged from the audience like a tide. It was the 10th anniversary celebration of Fengxing Capital, glasses clinking, elegant fragrances swirling, a scene of dazzling glamour. Long lenses from the media area were aimed at the stage, and finance journalists had already drafted their headlines. The ultimate power couple joins forces to build a new tech empire. Vera lifted the glass of champagne that had already gone cold. The moment her fingertips touched the glass, the memories, scalding, tearing, those images that had made her vomit blood alone in the dead of night, receded like a tide, leaving behind nothing but bone-deep calm. Vera. James stood at the center of the stage, impeccably dressed in a suit, his tie the one she had given him for his birthday last year, Italian custom-made, with a dark pattern embroidered with an eagle spreading its wings. He had said then, "Because you are the wings I soar on." Now that eagle was cinched just below his Adam's apple, rising and falling slightly with his affectionate tone. "I want to take this occasion to give you a surprise." His gaze shifted toward the side stage. There stood a young girl in a white dress, timid, her fingers twisting together like a fawn that had wandered into a jungle. Sylvia. 3 months into the job, assistant to the chief operating officer. She came from a poor family, it was said, and had put herself through an Ivy League school on student loans. Every meeting, she sat in the corner, her fingers trembling slightly when she handed over documents, her ears turning red if anyone so much as glanced at her. Jingming Technology's rapid growth owes itself to the infusion of fresh blood. James's voice was as warm and smooth as jade. This was his best performance, packaging himself as a discerning mentor who knew talent when he saw it. "Today, I want to introduce you to a young woman I hold in very high regard. She is the core member of our new project, and she has the potential to reshape the entire industry. Sylvia, come on up to the stage." The white dress wobbled slightly under the spotlight, as if burned by the light. Stepping onto the stage in her stiletto heels, Sylvia walked up to James's side, and when she took the microphone, her hands were indeed trembling, though Vera noticed that the tremor was so precisely measured it almost seemed rehearsed. She lowered her head, her lashes casting a shadow beneath her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. James." "Thank you, Miss Vera. I never expected this. I was just doing my part." Soft sighs drifted up from the audience. "What a good girl, frail, humble, the kind that makes you want to protect her." Vera's gaze swept across the crowd. Several partners at Fengxing Capital exchanged glances, some displeased, some suspicious. She saw Victor frown. This old partner, who had worked alongside her for 10 years, was probably worrying that she might rush onto the stage to claw at that girl. Someone from the media section was making a low phone call, likely drafting the headline, "Spouse Causes Chaos at Anniversary Celebration," in advance. Everyone was waiting for her to lose control. James's eyes met hers, brimming with audacity. He knew her too well. In her past life at this very moment, she had smashed her glass, stormed onto the stage, shoved Sylvia to the ground, and left her nails raking across that pitiful, delicate face. The next day, videos of the madwoman slapping the intern went viral across the internet. In his interview, James painfully admitted that their marriage was on the rocks, but insisted he still respected Miss Vera's contributions to the company. That painful expression alone earned him 3 million new followers. Vera placed the champagne glass back onto the waiter's tray. Her reflection shimmered on the porcelain-white marble floor, a sharply tailored black suit skirt, and the platinum necklace resting on her collarbone, an heirloom from her mother. Her mother had said, "Vera, the women of the Shin family must have a backbone of steel." She took the microphone from the host, her fingertips as steady as if gripping a scalpel. Thank you, James, she began, her voice soft yet clear, the banquet hall sound system carrying every word to every corner of the room. She smiled, a poised, hostess-like warmth, perfectly measured. But tonight's spotlight isn't on any individual. It's on the future we are about to witness together. She paused, her gaze drifting from James's face and sweeping across the entire audience. The chandelier's light fractured into tiny stars in her eyes, and no one could tell there was anything else hidden beneath. Taking advantage of today's occasion, I officially announce that Fengxing Capital will launch the Tech Unicorn Incubation Program. The initial funding, she paused for a beat, watching the crowd in the hall fall silent, is 1 billion. Dedicated to incubating promising startups like Jingming Technology. This is Fengxing Capital's commitment to the future, and it is also my commitment to every entrepreneur here today. Applause started from a corner. Then from the media section. Then from the entire hall. There was genuine excitement in that applause. $1 billion was no small amount in this capital winter. There was also a thrill from the spectacle, James's meticulously prepared surprise effortlessly folded by Vera into a larger narrative of her own. Vera watched James. The corners of his mouth still held that affectionate curve, but the muscles around his eyes twitched involuntarily. The microphone in his hand hung forgotten. From the side stage, Sylvia clenched the hem of her white dress, her knuckles turning pale. James, Vera's voice was as gentle as if soothing a child, your new project can serve as the first internal incubation case under our plan. You've got ambition, and no one is happier about that than I am. Her words landed in the air, each one like a precisely positioned chess piece. A few old foxes who had spent years navigating the capital markets narrowed their eyes. The words sounded beautiful, but translated, they meant, you were incubated by me, supported by me, a single piece on my chessboard. Of course, James understood. But he couldn't argue. With $1 billion in funding, media cameras, and the eyes of the entire industry on him, showing any hint of displeasure at this moment would land tomorrow's headline as Jingming Technology CEO bites the hand that feeds him. He could only smile. The effort was painful, like a paper-cut silhouette pasted onto a face soaked in water. As for the more personal good news, Vera looked at him, even adding a hint of playfulness to her tone, we'll talk about that when your project truly becomes #1 in the industry, okay? The whole room burst into laughter. It was the kind of warm, forgiving laughter that comes from the playful contrast of a tough businesswoman being coy. No one thought she was sending a veiled warning, everyone saw her as the perfect partner, deeply affectionate, magnanimous, and magnanimous. Only James knew that the rope around his neck had just been tightened another notch, gently, tenderly, and to everyone else, seemingly carelessly. Sylvia stood in the wings, a mere shadow. The little gestures she had meticulously prepared, lowering her head to twist her fingers, biting her lip, hesitating to speak, had all lost their stage. No one noticed her. With a 10 billion plan, Vera had reduced her from someone special to just another member of the project team, her name not even mentioned. As Vera turned back to her seat, the corner of her eye caught Sylvia's face. For an instant, something flickered across that pure, innocent visage, greed? Resentment? Malice? Too fast, like the refraction of a crystal chandelier. But Vera saw it. She picked up the freshly poured champagne and took a delicate sip. A trace of her lipstick stained the rim, coral, warm and harmless. For the rest of the celebration, James was surrounded by investors, forcing a smile as he fielded questions about the billion plan. Vera, meanwhile, was pulled aside by a group of businesswomen for photos. They draped their arms over her shoulders and said, Vera, you're truly a role model for all women. No one mentioned Sylvia again. During a break in the photos, Vera glanced back. Sylvia was standing alone by the dessert station, holding an untouched glass of juice, her gaze fixed on James's back as he was swarmed by a crowd, her nails digging into her palm. Under the fawn's hooves, a knife was hidden. But that didn't matter. Vera turned back, smiling at the camera, revealing 8 perfect teeth. Out of the corner of her eye, she took in the brilliantly lit financial district beyond the hall in the night, the glass curtain walls reflecting the city's ambition and greed. She had already completed the first step of her rebirth. Next, she would personally move every piece on this chessboard to where it belonged. Over the next 3 weeks, Sylvia showed up more regularly than a clock puncher. Vera sat in the office on the top floor, watching the commotion at the end of the hallway through the one-way glass. Every time the girl came, she carried a craft paper file folder, wearing a floral skirt with a plain cardigan over it, her ponytail tied low, with a few stray strands of hair always brushing across her forehead. "Miss Vera, this is Mr. James's feasibility report for the new project. I wanted to ask you to take a look at it first." She stood before Vera's desk, her voice soft. "I know I'm not at the right level, but Mr. James said you're an expert in this field, and I'm afraid there might be data errors." Vera took the document, flipped through 2 pages, and paused her fingertip over a certain figure. Without looking up, she said in a calm tone, "The Q3 user growth forecast here, did you use linear regression?" Sylvia's fingers twisted the edge of her cardigan. "Yes, that's right. The growth curve of consumer internet has never been linear." Vera closed the file and pushed it back. "Go back and tell James this model needs to be redone. If he needs help, I can have Fengxing's data analysis team assist." "No need." Sylvia's voice suddenly rose slightly before quickly dropping back down, like a startled bird. "I mean, thank you, Miss Vera, but I can change it myself. I don't want to keep troubling you and Mr. James." In the moment she lowered her head, Vera caught the frequency of her eyelash flutters. Those tremors were calculated with precision, a hair more would be deliberate, a hair less insufficiently pitiable. In her past life, she had only thought this girl was timid and endearing, but now she saw clearly, hidden within those tremors was ambition. "Sylvia." Vera suddenly spoke, her tone softening a few degrees. "Sit down." Sylvia froze for a moment before settling onto the edge of the chair opposite, perching on only half of it. Vera stood up and walked to the window. The sunset over the financial district was turning the entire row of glass curtain walls into a blazing gold and red, her silhouette etched sharply against the light. "James has been under a lot of pressure lately. The new project is burning through money, and a few of the internal partners aren't too optimistic about it. I support him, of course, but..." She turned around, looking at Sylvia, a hint of genuine girlfriend-to-girlfriend sincerity in her eyes. "There are some things I'm not comfortable saying to him directly, I'm afraid of hurting his pride. Could you keep a closer eye on the risk control side of the project? Some data can't just be made to look good on paper." A glimmer flashed in Sylvia's eyes for a moment, the gleam of a hunter catching the scent of blood, quickly veiled by her lowered eyelids. "Miss Vera, you can rest assured." She stood up, holding the file folder, and nodded solemnly. "I'll make sure every step is handled properly." As she turned and walked out of the office, Vera noticed her steps were quicker than when she came in. That irrepressible excitement of someone who thought they had just gotten hold of crucial intel. Vera sat back down in her chair and turned on the computer. On the screen was a document she had marked in red, Jingming Technologies Overseas Expansion Plan. All the inflated revenue figures and hidden risks had been highlighted in yellow. In another encrypted file, information about Sylvia's distant cousin, a senior executive at a rival venture capital firm, sat quietly, waiting for the moment it would be needed. She dialed an internal line. "Victor, help me set up a meeting with Gordon from Fengxing Capital. Tell him that at tomorrow's cocktail party, I have a few questions to ask him about talent mobility within the industry." Putting down the phone, she gazed at the sun, already half sunk beyond the window. James was probably in his office right now, poring over the data sheet Sylvia had optimized, dreaming of a cross-border merger. The last time he called, the arrogance in his voice had already become impossible to hide. He had started calling her Sister Vera with a condescending tone, as if he no longer needed her protection. Meanwhile, Sylvia was probably hiding in some break room right now, sending encrypted messages to her cousin from a burner account. Vera closed her laptop and pulled out a copy of Das Kapital from her bag, flipping to a certain page. Tucked between the pages was a photo, a candid shot from an industry summit in her past life, capturing Sylvia arm in arm with that cousin as they walked into a hotel, both grinning like mice that had just gotten away with stolen oil. She carefully tucked the photo back in place. It was time to feed the prey the second round of bait. The next afternoon, James's call came in. His voice brimmed with barely contained excitement. Vera. Sylvia just showed me the new data model. The Q3 forecast has been revised up by 40%. The overseas partner also sent a letter of intent, the one you introduced last time. They said they're willing to co-invest. Vera tucked her phone between her ear and shoulder, continuing to flip through a due diligence report. She heard herself say in a delighted tone, "Really? That's great, James. I told you could do it." But James's tone suddenly hesitated. "What about that bridge loan? Can Fengxing speed things up a bit? The first installment from the partner is due next week." Vera turned the due diligence report to the last page. There, she found the complete background check on that so-called partner, 3 shell companies nested within each other, the actual controller blacklisted by the Monetary Authority of Singapore 2 years ago for cross-border fraud. Of course, she was the only one who had seen this report so far. "I'll push finance tomorrow." "Don't worry," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness. After hanging up, she locked the due diligence report in the safe, then added a reminder to her calendar. "Next Wednesday, anonymously report a case of abnormal cross-border capital flow to the Financial Regulatory Hotline." After finishing all this, she walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. Night had completely fallen, and the lights of the financial district flowed like a golden river. Countless Jameses and Sylvias inhabited those high-rise buildings, greedy, calculating people who thought themselves clever, who believed the world was their playground. Vera looked at her reflection in the glass and curved the corners of her mouth slightly. "Go ahead," she murmured softly. "The bigger, the better." When the alarm sounded, James was in a video conference with an overseas partner. He watched as the man in the suit on the other end of the screen, speaking with a Singaporean accent, suddenly changed expression, muttered an "I'm sorry," and cut the connection. Then the finance director burst through his office door, face pale. "Mr. James, the Bridge Loan Bank, they say we're suspected of illegal guarantees and have frozen all accounts." James's first instinct was to call Vera. The phone rang 7 times. No one answered. He then called Sylvia. The girl's voice sounded even more panicked than his. "Mr. James. I don't know. The data was all done according to your instructions." "Enough." He threw the phone down. At Jingming Technology's office, a doomsday silence had settled in. The clatter of keyboards ceased, chatter in the break room died out, everyone was scrolling through industry news on their phones. Jingming Technology's overseas project stalls, partner suspected of fraud, bridge loan dries up, unicorn crashes overnight. James locked himself in his office and loosened the dark patterned eagle tie. Staring at the data report Sylvia had optimized on his desk, a realization suddenly struck him. When he had signed that illegal guarantee agreement, he had trusted Sylvia too much. She had handled every intermediate step. But what if he pinned it all on her? Once that thought took root, it grew like a wild vine. She was just an assistant. A girl from a poor family who had risen through his support. Everyone would believe she had faked the data to please him, to climb the ladder. He had been deceived, a victim. He grabbed the phone, then put it down again. No, directly pushing it would seem too deliberate. He needed someone who could convey this truth on his behalf. Sylvia was crouched in the coffee shop downstairs from Jingming Technology, her fingers trembling as she tapped on her phone screen. Her cousin's messages kept popping up one after another. "What were you thinking? You didn't even check the background of that partner before jumping in? Now that it's out, we can't even try to scoop it up, it's too hot to handle. Figure out how to get out of this yourself, don't drag me into it." She bit down hard on her lower lip, the taste of iron filling her mouth. How did things come to this? Just last week, she thought everything was under control. She had obtained Vera's internal information that couldn't be shared with James. Her cousin was ready to take over at a low price, And she had even started planning how to drain the last of James's connections and resources after his bankruptcy. But now, Vera's phone couldn't be reached either. The public relations department of Fengxing Capital had a unified response to the outside world. Regarding the specific situation of the invested company, we are conducting an internal investigation. Sylvia gripped her phone tightly. She suddenly remembered that 3 days ago, Vera had invited her out for an afternoon tea alone. At that 3-Michelin-star French restaurant, Vera slid a printed email draft across the table to her. It was from James's email account to Vera, titled Explanation Regarding Abnormal Project Data, which detailed the evidence of her having unauthorizedly altered core data. Vera had sighed at the time, folded the draft, and placed it back into her bag. "Sylvia, you're too young." Her voice carried a weary compassion. "That's how this circle works. When disaster strikes, someone has to be sacrificed. I don't want it to be you." Back then, Sylvia had only thought that Vera was trying to win her over, to ally with her against James. She had even sneered to herself, the more these two fools tore at each other, the better her chance to reap the benefits. But now she understood. What Vera had handed her wasn't an olive branch, it was a blade. She had simply let her see in advance when James would stab her. As for James, that man who, just 2 days ago, was calling Vera's sister Vera on a video conference, who bragged in front of her that women are made to be stepped on, was probably already writing the second version of his explanation statement. Sylvia stood up, her knee bumping into the coffee table, spilling the latte in her cup all over the table. She didn't care. She rushed out and flagged down a taxi. To Fengxing Capital. Her voice trembled as she gave the address. Vera stood in the conference room on the top floor of Fengxing Capital. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sky was a leaden gray before the storm. Only a single floor lamp was lit inside, casting a long shadow of her against the wall. The monitoring screen on the wall was divided into 4 panes. One showed Sylvia's fleeing back as she dashed out of the cafe entrance. Another captured James pacing and pulling at his hair in the hallway of Jingming Technology's office. A third displayed the figure of the overseas partner checking out of a hotel lobby. The 4th pane was empty, reserved for her. Standing in the light at that moment, her expression was as calm as deep still water. She zoomed in on James' pane. The man was speaking into his phone, his lips moving rapidly. He was likely fabricating another new script. She turned up the volume and caught fragments of sentences. "Yes, it's all her fault. I had no idea. You have to believe me." Vera muted the sound. She walked over to the conference table and picked up the complete evidence package, already prepared for submission to the regulatory authorities. The original documents with James's signature, screenshots of emails between Sylvia and her cousin, the shell company structure chart of the partner. Every link in the chain was seamless, each step handled by her, yet none of it could be traced back to her instructions. Rain finally began to fall outside, with coin-sized raindrops slamming against the glass curtain wall, quickly merging into streaks that blurred the lights of the financial district into hazy patches of color. Vera placed the evidence package into a document folder and zipped it shut. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow is the board meeting. James will show up with his victim script, and Sylvia will probably come with her "I was the one being used" story. They will tear into each other, expose each other, and lay out their ugliest sides for everyone to see. All she has to do is sit there, and just when they think the situation is chaotic enough, gently slide that document folder onto the table. She walked over to the window, gazing through the rain at the building bearing the Jingming Technology sign. Once, she had thought it was a shared castle with James, but now, it looked no more than a pile of steel and concrete blocks, ones that would collapse into ruins the moment the bottommost piece was pulled out. She raised a finger, drew a circle on the fogged-up glass, then sliced a line through its center. "To pray," she said silently to her own reflection in the window. "You can start tearing at each other now." Just then, the conference room door was knocked on, 3 taps, urgent. Vera withdrew her hand, straightened her collar, and walked over to open it. Standing outside the door was Sylvia, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, her makeup mostly smeared, looking like a drowned white cat. "Miss Vera," she gasped, tears streaming from those innocent eyes, "you have to help me. He's trying to pin everything on me. I have proof, he's committed numerous regulatory violations, and I can testify against him." Vera looked at her. Rainwater dripped from Sylvia's chin onto the marble floor, forming small dark puddles. That carefully maintained pitiful face, which had lasted 3 months, was now slightly twisted with panic and malice, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes becoming visible. Vera stepped aside from the doorway. The corridor light shone over her, illuminating half her face while the other half remained in shadow. "Come in," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of hesitation and sympathy. "Sylvia, take your time and tell me exactly what happened." She turned and walked back toward her desk, her back to Sylvia, and finally let the faintest curve touch her lips. The smile was so slight it was nearly invisible. The prey had already walked into the cage on its own. All she had to do now was gently close the door. When dawn broke tomorrow, when everyone had gathered for the board meeting, she would cast out the chain of evidence in her hands. James would see the guarantee contract he signed with his own hand enlarged on the screen. Sylvia would watch the emails she sent to her cousin, each one marked with timestamps. And she would stand in the light, and say in the most elegant, gentlest voice, "I regret this, but we must pursue legal action." At that moment, the expressions on the faces of the onlookers below would be the sweetest dessert of this feast. Vera walked back to her desk, sat down, and gestured for Sylvia to take a seat as well. The rain was still falling, pounding against the glass like countless tiny, icy laughs. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Vera woke up at 7, 40 minutes before her alarm. Lying on the gray sheets, she stared at the unlit chandelier on the ceiling, hand-blown in Italy, with 3,600 crystal pieces, identical to the one in the banquet hall. When James had originally bought this penthouse apartment, he specifically chose the same chandelier, calling it the anchor point of their love. Now those crystal shards hang silently upside down, each one like a closed eye. She got up and took a 20-minute cold shower. The force of the water pounding against her shoulder blades brought her clarity. After changing, she stood before the full-length mirror and examined herself, a dark gray suit, pearl stud earrings, her hair tied up, revealing the full line of her neck. This outfit carried no aggression, as if she were heading to an ordinary business meeting. That was exactly what she wanted, to make everyone feel she wasn't ready to fight yet. At 8:45, she stepped into Fengxing Capital's office area. The receptionist looked up at her, hesitated as if wanting to say something. The atmosphere on the entire floor was off, the phone rang half as often as usual, and whispered discussions were cut short in the break room the moment she walked by. Vera nodded to everyone, said good morning as usual, then walked straight into her own office. She closed the door, retrieved the craft paper file from the drawer, and set it on the corner of the desk. Then she opened her computer and scrolled through today's preview articles from financial media outlets. Jingming Technologies capital chain breaks, Fengxing Capital faces 1 billion bad debt risk. The myth of the power couple shattered, insider trading suspicions loom. The headlines grew more sensational by the minute. But Vera noticed that not a single outlet dared to use Vera as the subject. All accusations still pointed at the company level, and, at James. After all, those anonymous tip-off letters, she had painstakingly crafted them over 2 weeks, channeling through 5 different offshore servers from overseas, precisely targeting the inboxes of regulatory bodies and major financial media. At 9:50, she walked into the conference room with a cup of coffee in hand. 8 people were already seated on either side of the long, rectangular black walnut conference table, 6 partners of Fengxing Capital, an external independent director, and the legal affairs director. Light seeped through the gaps in the blinds, slicing into thin strips across each face, fragmenting every expression into pieces. James sat at the far end of the table. He had chosen that spot, closest to the projector, farthest from her. Today he wore a dark blue suit with a matte black tie, a solid color. He looked thinner than usual, with hollowed eyes and prominent cheekbones. Seeing her enter, he stood up as if to greet her, but then stopped in his tracks as if nailed to the spot. His lips twitched slightly, and in the end, he only said, "Vera." There was a note of probing in his tone. Those two words came out of his mouth as cautiously as if he were walking on ice. Vera nodded at him, walked over to her seat at the head of the table, and sat down. She placed her coffee cup on her left side and the document folder on her right, then folded her hands together on the table. Leaning back in her chair with a relaxed posture. "Let's begin," she said. The head of legal spoke first. In a flat, verdict-like tone, he laid out Jingming Technology's current breach of contract situation, the amount frozen by the bank, and the dead hole left after the overseas partner went missing. The numbers came out one after another, like toppling dominoes. Vera saw James's Adam's apple bob up and down. Regarding the issue of data fabrication, Victor suddenly interjected, pushing up his glasses, his gaze sliding from Vera's face to James's. "We've conducted a preliminary internal investigation. In the third quarter forecast report submitted by Jingming Technology, at least 5 core parameters are clearly inflated." "Mr. James, who prepared this report?" James didn't answer immediately. He stared at the open document spread out before him on the table, his fingers repeatedly rubbing the edge of the paper. In the silence of the room, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner vent. Then he looked up. It was Sylvia, he said, his voice low, carrying the weariness and pain of a betrayed man. "I failed to see it. I trusted her too much. She approached me in every way, earned my trust, and then tampered with the data. I only uncovered everything yesterday. I've already asked HR to compile evidence of her misconduct. If necessary, I can." He stopped mid-sentence. Because Vera had opened that craft paper file folder. The first document she pulled out was pushed to the center of the desk. On it, James's signature stood out, glaringly sharp, black ink, forceful strokes, each one carrying the certainty of an ambitious man staking his claim. An unauthorized guarantee agreement. The original. "James," Vera spoke, her voice not loud, but every word was clear and precise. "Have you forgotten? This was the agreement I advised you not to sign. That night in my apartment, you said the partner was rushing you. I told you the bridge loan hadn't come through yet and to wait 2 more weeks." She looked at him, her gaze as calm as a winter lake. "You said, time waits for no one. Then you signed it right in front of me. Victor can vouch for that. The next day in your office, you discussed the funding arrangements with him over this agreement." Everyone turned to Victor. He was silent for 3 seconds. Then he took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and nodded. "Yes. Mr. James told me at the time that Miss Vera had already agreed." James's back went rigid. The expression of weary, wronged victim on his face was cracking apart piece by piece, like the bed of a dry river. He opened his mouth, reached a hand toward the document, then pulled it back. Vera pulled out a second document. "This is the email correspondence between you and that overseas partner." She slid the file forward. In the emails, the other party explicitly mentioned that its affiliate company had historical compliance issues, and your reply was, "As long as the funds can be disbursed on schedule, everything else can be handled flexibly." Third document. Fourth document. Fifth document. Each file spread out on the table was like a brick, building an ever higher barrier. The temperature in the conference room seemed to drop 2 degrees, the light seeping through the gaps in the blinds slowly shifting across James's face, first his forehead, then his cheekbones, then his constantly bobbing Adam's apple. Vera placed the last document on top. It was a draft James's email had sent her, a statement of explanation in which he intended to pin everything on Sylvia. The email remained in draft mode, unsent, but the body was complete, and even the attached evidence was neatly organized. She pushed it to the center of the meeting table. "James." She called his name, her voice even softer than before. "I was going to leave you with one last shred of dignity." As she said this, she lowered her gaze. It was an extremely subtle motion, the corners of her eyes dropping by half an inch, her lashes covering the upper edge of her pupils. Everyone present saw a heartbroken but restrained woman, still clinging to some almost old-fashioned kindness even after being betrayed by the man she had loved for 10 years. Only Vera herself knew that she lowered her eyes just to confirm whether the order of the files laid out before her was correct. From left to right, from light to heavy, the email draft thrown out last was the final straw that would break James's psychological defenses. She lifted her gaze again. "But you shouldn't have," she said, her speech slowing by a beat. "After making these professional misconducts, you still wanted to push a young girl forward as the scapegoat." The conference room door swung open at that moment. Sylvia stood at the entrance. Her hair had been tidied up again, she had changed into a plain white shirt, and her face was powdered, but the dark circles under her eyes were still impossible to cover. Clutched in her arms was a stack of documents even thicker than the last time she had visited Vera's office, and the joints of her fingers were pale from gripping too tightly. "I have evidence." Her voice trembled, but every word came through clearly. "James made me falsify the data. He said it himself, write it higher, investors only look at the growth curve. I have a recording." She pulled a black voice recorder from her shirt pocket. In that instant, James's face turned the color of ash, the hue of paper embers after they've burned out. He stood up. The chair leg scraped against the floor with a piercing screech. "Sylvia." His voice climbed, cracking on the syllable, like a string snapping. "You." "Sit down," Vera said. Just 2 words, devoid of any emotion. But the air in the entire conference room seemed to have been partially drained, sucking in every sound. James stood there, hands braced against the table's edge, his knuckles trembling, but in the end, he sat back down. Sylvia walked in and sat down, leaving an empty seat between herself and Vera. She placed the voice recorder on the table, her finger hovering over the play button without pressing it. She looked at James, and in her eyes, the once carefully crafted timidity and admiration had now dissolved into something purer, more primal, fear and venom. "Mr. James," she said, her lips quivering. "When you told me to falsify the data, you said, once we pull off this project, our future is secured. You also said, you said that Ms. Vera wouldn't keep you on a leash forever, that sooner or later you'd have your own money and your own say." She pressed the play button. The audio played James's voice, carrying that characteristic tone he used with investors, confident, almost arrogant. "Sylvia, bump this number up by 40%. Investors don't look at the details, they look at the trends. As long as the curve looks good, I'll handle the rest. I'll talk to Vera about it. She won't suspect a thing." The recording was short. Just over 20 seconds. But it was enough. The conference room fell so silent that you could hear the rhythm of everyone's breathing. Someone was quietly glancing at their phone, probably sending a message to the media, saying, "Something big is going down." Vera picked up her coffee and took a sip. It had already gone cold, but she swallowed it without changing her expression. She looked at James. At this moment, the man was maintaining an extremely bizarre posture, sitting upright, hands resting on his knees, as if he were still attending some solemn, rigid ceremony. But his face was empty. The expression had been drained from it, leaving only a skeleton holding up the skin. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was saying Vera, over and over, silently, like a drowning man calling out to the name of a ship already sailing away. Vera set the coffee cup down. "Mr. James." She changed her address, clean and sharp, like a scalpel severing a tendon. "The facts regarding Jingming Technologies' regulatory violations and data fraud are clear, and the chain of evidence is complete. Fengxing Capital, as the investor, will pursue the financial and legal responsibilities of the relevant parties in accordance with the law. Furthermore," she turned to the legal director, "in my personal capacity, I will reclaim all the bridge funds previously advanced to Jingming Technology. Please have the legal department send out the letter this afternoon." The legal director nodded. The pen tip scratched softly against the notebook. Vera stood up. When she rose, the chair made no sound. She walked around the long table, stopped beside James, and paused. The rain outside had long stopped, and sunlight was now breaking through the clouds, stretching the blind shadows once again. Light fell on her shoulder, and the pearl earrings reflected a small, warm circle of luster. She bent down, leaning close to James's ear, lowering her voice to a volume only the two of them could hear. "Do you remember," she said, each word carrying a faint, almost imperceptible trace of a smile, "the first time you told me I love you? It was on that pedestrian bridge in the financial street. The wind was fierce that day, and you said you wanted to stand at the highest place, so I would have to look up at you." She straightened up and took half a step back. "Now you're there," she said, her voice returning to a normal volume, clear, proper, audible to everyone. "Falling from a height of 140 meters, James. How does it feel?" She turned and walked toward the door. Her black stiletto heels struck the marble floor at a rhythm as steady as a metronome. When she reached the door, she paused. Without turning back, she merely tilted her head slightly. "Miss Sylvia," she said, "leave the recorder behind. The legal department needs to back it up." She then pushed open the door and walked out. In the office cubicles, all heads lifted from behind their screens, dozens of eyes tracking her figure as she crossed the corridor, until she disappeared into the elevator. Behind her, the sound of a chair toppling over came from the conference room, followed by Sylvia's frantic, tear-choked voice, "Don't touch me. I told you, he made me do all of it." Vera pressed the down button on the elevator. The bronze doors reflected her face, expression calm, as if she had just finished a Pilates class. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside, and just before the doors closed, she took one last look at the half-open conference room door at the end of the corridor, from where came the sounds of arguing, the rustling of documents, and a short, exasperated laugh from someone. She withdrew her gaze. The elevator doors shut, and the numbers descended one by one. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. It was a message from Victor. "The media has already caught wind. Are you sure you want to show up at the press conference?" She replied with a single word, "Yeah." Then she closed the chat and opened her photo album. Inside was a photo, nearly 10 years old now, the resolution already a bit blurry, on the overpass in the financial district, the wind messing up her hair. Next to her stood a young man in a plaid shirt, his eyes crinkled into two slits as he laughed. That was James. Back then, he had nothing, not even enough to treat her to a French meal without saving up half a month's salary. Vera deleted the photo. A system notification popped up on her phone, permanently deleted. Cannot be recovered. She locked the screen. The elevator arrived at the ground floor just then. The doors opened, and sunlight from the lobby poured in, spreading a warm, golden glow across the floor. She stepped out and tilted her head back. The sky had cleared. The press conference was set for 3 in the afternoon. Vera went home and changed her clothes. She put on a black velvet dress, cinched at the waist but not tight-fitting. From the depths of her wardrobe, she retrieved her mother's necklace, a platinum chain with a small emerald pendant, passed down from her grandmother to her mother, and then to her. Her mother used to say that the women of the Shin family don't wear diamonds. Diamonds are too sharp, they can cut others and themselves. Emeralds nurture the wearer, and hold their own. She stood in front of the mirror, examining herself. No heavy makeup, just a touch of lipstick, coral, the same shade she wore on the night of the banquet. She let her hair down, letting it fall over her shoulders, and gave a faint smile. The reflection in the mirror smiled back. A gentle, harmless smile, betraying no trace of aggression. At 1:45, she got into the car and headed to the venue. The driver glanced at her several times in the rearview mirror, as if wanting to say something but holding back. Vera didn't respond, simply staring out the window. The ginkgo trees lining both sides of the financial district were turning yellow, their leaves drifting down with the wind, carpeting the black asphalt like scattered flakes of gold foil. "Miss Vera," the driver finally spoke, "are you all right?" I saw those things online. I'm fine, she said. Drive steadily. At 2:20, she walked into the press conference venue. This was the news briefing hall that Fengxing Capital had leased long-term, capable of holding 300 people, now filled to 90% capacity. Financial journalists, tech journalists, entertainment journalists, the entertainment reporters outnumbered the other two combined. 3 rows of cameras and microphones were set up, flashes crackling like a prelude to an approaching storm's lightning. In the backstage lounge, Victor was waiting for her. His expression wasn't good, a printed copy of the public opinion briefing clutched in his hand. The whole internet is now guessing whether you're going to publicly tear into the scumbag. 6 of the top 10 trending topics are related to you. Are you sure you want to do this yourself? The PR department can handle it for you. I'll do it myself. Vera sat in front of the vanity mirror, giving the clasp of her necklace one last adjustment. Victor, how long have you been with me? 10 years. Then you know I never take on a job I'm not sure I can handle. Victor was silent for 2 seconds, then set the briefing down. He patted her shoulder, said nothing, and left first. At 2:50, James was escorted by legal and security personnel to sit in another room backstage. As Vera passed by the room, she glanced through the crack in the door. He had changed his shirt, his collar was open, and his dark patterned eagle tie was nowhere to be seen. He sat with his arms crossed, his face utterly blank, like an emptied vessel. His lawyer sat beside him, rapidly flipping through documents. The two occasionally murmured to each other, their words inaudible. Vera looked away and walked toward the wings of the stage. At 3 o'clock. After a brief introduction by the host, Victor took the stage first, announcing the termination of the partnership between Fengxing Capital and Jingming Technology. He read a statement, his words restrained, laying out 3 conclusions: serious misconduct by core management, data fabrication, and initiation of legal proceedings. There were sharp intakes of breath from the audience. The sound of camera shutters was as dense as rain pounding on a tin roof. Then Victor said, "Now let's invite Ms. Vera to speak. She will provide a final explanation of this matter in her personal capacity." The whole venue dimmed for a moment. All the lights were lowered at once, leaving only a single spotlight on the podium at the center of the stage. Vera stepped out from the side curtain. As she walked into that beam of light, the sound of her high heels hitting the floor was picked up by the microphone, as sharp and clear as the stroke of a bell. She stood behind the podium, hands resting on its surface, leaning forward slightly. "No notes. Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her voice steady. "I am Vera. Standing here today, I have 2 announcements to make. First, regarding Jingming Technology's previous violations of regulatory guarantees and data fabrication, I have compiled a complete chain of evidence and submitted it to the regulatory authorities. The process of holding the relevant parties legally accountable will be initiated today." She paused for a beat, her gaze sweeping across the entire venue. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on her, hundreds of recording devices glowing red. Second, her voice softened slightly, "I am resigning from my position as managing partner of Fengxing Capital, effective immediately." The room erupted into chaos. Someone stood up, camera flashes went off like mad. A reporter in the front row shouted, "Miss Vera, is this to take responsibility for the Jingming Technology incident?" Vera looked at the reporter and smiled. It was a faint smile, the corners of her lips lifting no more than 3 millimeters. Taking responsibility and choosing to leave on my own are 2 different things. She turned a page of the paper in front of her. There was nothing written on it, just a blank page, but she needed the gesture to create a visual transition for the entire room. "I've lived here for 15 years, she said, her gaze settling on some empty point in the air across the venue. "From intern to partner, from being alone to leading a team. Fengxing Capital is a child I watched grow up. But children have their own paths to take, and I have mine." She suddenly tilted her head slightly, her eyes landing on a corner in the last row. There sat a woman in a white shirt, arms crossed, face pale as death, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Sylvia." She didn't deserve to be on stage. But she came. Sitting in the last row, huddled in the shadows, like a spectator. Vera looked in her direction, as if seeing her, yet also looking past her to somewhere farther. Regarding personal emotions, she said, I do not intend to respond to any speculation. The entanglement between Mr. James and me is a decade of trust and betrayal accumulated over 10 years. Some debts can never be fully settled. But standing here today, I want to say one thing to everyone. She withdrew her gaze and refocused on the camera. Trust is the backbone of a financial institution. Once it breaks, don't try to piece it back together with lies. Whether it's 10 years or 20, things built on falsehoods can never bear any weight. She gave a slight nod toward the audience. That concludes my statement. Thank you. She picked up the glass of water on the podium, took a sip, then turned to walk toward the side stage. The moment she turned, a commotion erupted from backstage. James's voice leaked through an open microphone. He had already rushed out of the lounge, held back by 2 security personnel 7 meters from the stage, but the wireless mic he had snatched broadcast his voice to every corner of the venue. Vera. You've been scheming against me all along. His voice cracked, hoarse and broken, the final howl of a beast stripped of all its disguises. You knew that business partner had issues. You deliberately set me up. That billion was just. Mr. James. Vera stopped at the side stage and turned her face. The spotlight caught only half her silhouette, the other half sinking into the shadows. Her voice, picked up by the backup microphone handed over by the host, wasn't loud, but it overpowered his roars. Those 10 billion in funds, I announced them publicly at the Tech Unicorn Incubation Program launch event. You were standing on that stage that day too, you heard it, and the entire industry heard it. She turned back, took 2 steps forward, and reappeared at the edge of the spotlight. Not retreating fully into the light, nor stepping completely into the darkness. What I said was incubation, not gifting. What I said was nurturing, not unconditional bailout. In the guarantee agreement you signed, it clearly states, risk to be borne by the party itself. Fengxing Capital reserves the right of recourse. She looked at James. The man, with his arms held by 2 security guards, had a face twisted by sheer rage, veins bulging on his cheekbones. There was no trace left of the gentle, refined gentleman he once appeared to be. You saw it when you signed, she said. Silence fell over the entire room. Then the shutter clicks exploded once more, journalists frantically pressing down, capturing every single frame of James's expression at this moment, the face of a hypocrite whose mask had been brutally torn off, revealing the festering, rotten visage beneath that even he didn't want to recognize. James opened his mouth. He wanted to say, but the partner you referred me to was problematic. He also wanted to say, when you said I trust him at the board meeting, you knew it was a lie. But not a single word could he utter, because saying those words would mean admitting that he had known the partner was problematic yet still jumped in, admitting that he had known her trust might carry other implications yet still exploited that trust to pursue his own greed. No matter what he says, it only serves to incriminate himself. A muffled sound escaped his throat, like swallowing shattered glass. Then his knees buckled, his entire weight hanging from the security staff's arms. They half-dragged, half-carried him backstage, and the door slammed shut. Vera stood there for 3 seconds. Then she turned around and faced the entire audience once more. The flashbulbs were still popping, but she stood steady, like a tree that had been buffeted by wind for so long its roots had sunk deep into the bedrock. I've said my piece, she said. Thank you all for coming. She walked down from the stage. As she passed the last row, there were 3 seats between her and Sylvia. She stared straight ahead, but her peripheral vision caught the scene. Sylvia was sitting there with her arms crossed, her shoulders trembling, tears streaming from her eyes and dripping down her chin onto her white shirt, spreading into small dark patches. No one was looking at her. No camera was aimed at her. All the cameras followed Vera's retreating figure until she disappeared through the side door. Sylvia lowered her head and buried her face in her hands. Her fingers were trembling, but not from sadness. It was because of that pop-up message that had just appeared on her phone screen. The last WeChat message from her cousin flashed across the screen. "I can't handle your situation anymore. The lawsuit for breach of non-compete has already been sent to your email. You're on your own." She turned her phone over and placed it face down on her knee. The side door had already closed. Vera was gone. That evening at 8 o'clock, Vera sat on the balcony of her apartment, a glass of warm milk placed before her. Her phone lay on the wicker coffee table, the screen lighting up every few seconds, message notifications, calls, mentions across various social platforms, all the fragmented information surging in like waves, then receding. She didn't look at it. She simply held the cup in her hands, gazing down at the lights of the financial district below. Someone rang the doorbell. She got up to answer it. It was the property manager handing her a courier envelope. The sender field read Legal Department, Fengxing Capital, and inside were a copy of the severance agreement she had already signed, along with a confirmation slip for the bridge loan funds she had recovered in her personal capacity. She brought it inside and placed the envelope on the entryway cabinet. Then she walked back to the terrace. Moonlight fell into her glass of milk, floating a small patch of warm white. Vera picked up her phone and finally glanced at it. She didn't open a single message, but simply checked her bank account, the one held under an offshore trust, which had worked tirelessly over the past 3 months to complete her capital divestment and reallocation. There it sat, a 7-figure sum. And another zero after that. She looked at the string of numbers and slowly finished the last sip of milk in her glass. Then she opened her Notes app, created a new document, and typed 2 lines as the title, Nirvana Capital. Initial fund size, $5 billion. The cursor blinked in the document. The night breeze swept in, carrying the exhaust fumes from the traffic on Financial Street, the last lingering burnt aroma from the coffee shop before closing, and the dull roar of machinery from a distant construction site. These sounds mingled together, the unending breath of a city that never sleeps. Vera typed the first line. Investment target, long-termism. She typed this, paused for a moment, then deleted it and retyped 5 words. Investment target, Jingming Technologies core patents, assets under bankruptcy liquidation. She stared at the line of text, a faint smile curving her lips, then closed her phone. Across the terrace, 2 streets away, workers were dismantling Jingming Technologies' neon sign board piece by piece. The metal frames clanged against each other as they struck, the shattered blue light vanishing bit by bit from the night sky. Vera placed the empty cup back on the coffee table and stood up to go inside. As she passed the entryway, she idly flipped the resignation letter over and glanced at the back. A sticky note was attached there, in Victor's handwriting, "Waiting for you to come back." Or, "Waiting for you to surpass us." She tore off the sticky note, folded it twice, and tucked it into her pocket. Then she turned off the living room light. In the darkness, only the lights of the financial district outside streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm, checkered blocks of color across the gray floor, like a chessboard. Vera stood in that pool of light, looking down at her own shadow, stretched long, extending straight to the end of the entryway, like a path she had yet to walk. She took 2 steps forward, then stopped. 5 seconds later, she murmured something softly. Her voice was too low for anyone to hear, not even she herself caught the words. But the lingering tone of that sentence was swept away by the night air still stirring in the room, drifting through the half-open window toward the financial district, threading through the lights still burning and those that had just gone dark. "We're here," she seemed to say. With a faint smile, she turned and walked toward the bedroom. That night, she slept the deepest she had in 10 years. No dreams. As dawn broke, her phone powered on automatically, pushing a breaking financial headline. Fengxing Capital founder Vera announces new fund, first tranche raises $5 billion, oversubscribed by multiple top-tier international institutions. She turned off the screen and rolled over. Sunlight streamed through the window, landing warmly at the foot of the bed. From downstairs came the roar of morning rush hour traffic, fierce, vivid, relentless.